My husband waved his prenup in my face when I asked for anything during the divorce. Everything belonged to him according to the contract I had signed at 23. What he never knew was that my estranged father had named me sole heir to his $156 million estate 3 weeks before the papers were filed. When the executor's letter arrived at his office by mistake, I watched a man who thought he had won everything realize he had lost the only thing that mattered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Christopher told me I would leave our marriage with nothing, I was standing in the kitchen of our Scottsdale estate, watching dust particles drift through shafts of Arizona sunlight. 6 years of marriage had taught me to recognize the particular set of his jaw that meant he had already made a decision, and was simply waiting for the appropriate moment to announce it. That morning, while I poured his coffee into the Italian ceramic mug he preferred, measuring cream to the exact proportion he required, he delivered the news with the clinical detachment of a surgeon describing a necessary amputation. The prenuptial agreement is very clear, Vanessa. His voice carried the same tone he used when explaining investment strategies to clients who could not quite grasp the complexity of his recommendations. In the event of dissolution, you retain only assets you brought into the marriage independently. Everything else remains mine. The house, the cars, the investment portfolio, the vacation properties. All of it stays with me. I stood at the espresso machine, my hand steady on the chrome handle, and said nothing. What could I say that would not reveal too much or betray the storm of emotions churning beneath my carefully maintained composure? Christopher had spent our entire marriage teaching me that emotional responses were signs of weakness, that successful people operated from logic rather than feeling. I had learned the lesson well, perhaps too well for his ultimate comfort. Our home in Paradise Valley was a monument to Christopher's success as a wealth management advisor. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed views of Camelback Mountain, the desert landscape rendered in shades of rust and sage that shifted with the changing light. The interior had been designed by someone whose name apparently mattered in circles I had never quite penetrated. All clean lines and neutral tones that created an atmosphere of expensive serenity. Nothing in the house belonged to me in any meaningful sense. I had not selected the furniture or chosen the art or decided on the color palette. I had simply inhabited spaces that Christopher had created as extensions of his professional brand. He managed portfolios for some of the wealthiest families in Arizona, men and women who trusted him with generational fortunes and legacy planning. Our home served as a showpiece for potential clients, demonstrating that Christopher Hartwell understood not just financial strategy, but also the lifestyle that wealth should produce. Every dinner party we hosted, every casual gathering of his colleagues and their spouses, every carefully orchestrated social event served the dual purpose of entertainment and advertisement for his capabilities. My role in these performances had been established early in our marriage. I was the accomplished wife who added intellectual credibility without threatening to overshadow. I had my master's degree in art history from Arizona State University, a respectable credential that suggested cultural sophistication, without the aggressive ambition of a doctoral pursuit or professional career. I could discuss Renaissance painting techniques or contemporary installation art with enough facility to seem educated, but I never dominated conversations or insisted on steering discussions toward my interests when the men wanted to talk about market conditions or real estate development. Christopher had met me at a gallery opening in downtown Phoenix where I had been working as an assistant curator. The position paid modestly but allowed me to work with beautiful objects and occasionally contribute to exhibition planning. He had approached me as I stood before a massive abstract canvas, asking intelligent questions about the artist's technique and listening with apparent interest as I explained the piece's relationship to post-war American painting. 3 months later we were engaged. 6 months after that, we were married in a ceremony at the Arizona Biltmore that his mother had planned with military precision. The prenuptial agreement had been presented to me 3 weeks before the wedding. Christopher's attorney, a severe woman named Diane Rothstein who looked at me with the kind of clinical assessment usually reserved for livestock auctions, had walked me through 37 pages of legal language that essentially established one principle. Everything Christopher had before the marriage and everything he would earn during the marriage belonged exclusively to him. I would retain ownership of my personal possessions, my modest savings account, and whatever I might independently inherit or earn. At the time, those categories seemed to include very little of significance. My parents had divorced when I was 7 years old. My mother, Caroline, had raised me and my younger brother in a modest subdivision in Tempe, working as a high school English teacher and supplementing her income with summer school positions and evening tutoring. My father, Marcus Aldridge, had left us for another woman when I was still young enough that my memories of him were fragmentary and unreliable. He had moved to California, remarried, built a new family, and maintained only the most sporadic contact with the children from his first marriage. Birthday cards arrived irregularly, sometimes months late. Child support payments came when legally required but without any additional generosity. Occasional phone calls on major holidays were stilted and awkward. Conversations with a stranger who happened to share some genetic material. By the time I was a teenager, I had stopped expecting anything from Marcus Aldridge. He was simply a name on my birth certificate, a biological fact without emotional resonance. When Christopher's attorney had asked me to list any anticipated inheritances for the prenuptial agreement, I had honestly reported that I expected nothing significant. My mother lived on a teacher's pension and whatever she had managed to save. My father was a non-entity in my financial planning. The idea that either of them would leave me anything substantial enough to matter in the context of Christopher's wealth seemed absurd. I signed the prenuptial agreement with the naivete of a 23-year-old woman who believed that love would make financial arrangements irrelevant, that we were building something together that would transcend legal protections and contractual obligations. I signed believing that Christopher wanted to marry me because he valued who I was, not because I represented some strategic acquisition that required protection. The first 3 years of our marriage had been reasonably happy by conventional measures. We traveled to Europe, stayed in beautiful hotels, ate at restaurants where reservations required months of advance planning. Christopher was attentive in public, introducing me with obvious pride, occasionally reaching for my hand during social events. We attended the opera and gallery openings and charity galas where wealthy Phoenicians gathered to see and be seen. But gradually, subtly, the dynamic between us shifted. Christopher began making decisions without consulting me, explaining afterward that he had not wanted to burden me with details I would not understand. The joint checking account I had access to was quietly closed, replaced with an allowance system where Christopher transferred a set amount monthly for household expenses and personal needs. When I questioned the change, he explained that it was simply more efficient for tax purposes, that his accountant had recommended the structure. My friends from before the marriage slowly fell away, casualties of busy schedules and growing differences in lifestyle. The women I now spent time with were wives of Christopher's colleagues, perfectly groomed and impeccably dressed women who lunched at the country club and chaired charity committees. They were pleasant enough, but I never felt the easy intimacy I had once shared with graduate school friends who had known me before I became Mrs. Christopher Hartwell. I had stopped working shortly after our wedding. Christopher had suggested it would be better if I could focus on our home and social obligations, rather than splitting my attention with a demanding job. The gallery position had not paid enough to justify the complexity it added to our schedule, he had argued. I could always return to work later if I wanted, once we were more established. That later had never arrived. Instead, I had filled my days with activities that seemed productive but ultimately felt hollow. I volunteered at the Phoenix Art Museum, serving on committees that planned fundraising events and educational programming. I took classes in various subjects that interested me, accumulating knowledge without any particular purpose beyond personal enrichment. I maintained our home to Christopher's exacting standards, ensuring that everything ran smoothly so that he could focus on his demanding career. The loneliness had crept in gradually, like water seeping under a door. I would stand in our beautiful home, surrounded by expensive objects and carefully curated beauty, and feel profoundly isolated. Christopher worked long hours and traveled frequently for client meetings. When he was home, he was often distracted, checking his phone constantly, responding to emails at all hours. Our conversations became increasingly superficial, limited to logistics and social planning, rather than the deeper exchanges that had characterized our early relationship. I began to suspect that Christopher was having an affair about 8 months before he announced his intention to divorce. The signs were subtle at first. Unexplained absences, vague explanations about client dinners that ran late, a new attention to his appearance that seemed motivated by something beyond professional obligation. He began going to the gym more frequently, updating his wardrobe with more fashionable pieces, wearing cologne I had not purchased for him. Her name was Kelsey Brennan, and she was 31 years old, exactly 6 years younger than me. She worked as a financial analyst at Christopher's firm, one of those bright young professionals who radiated ambition and competence. I had met her several times at company events, had exchanged pleasantries about her recent promotion, and her impressive performance on various client accounts. She had looked at me with a mixture of pity and triumph that I had not fully understood until later. Christopher had not bothered to hide the affair particularly carefully once he decided it no longer mattered. I found hotel receipts in his jacket pocket, saw text messages flash across his phone screen when he left it unattended, noticed the way he smiled when certain calls came through during dinner. When I finally confronted him directly, asking whether he was involved with someone else, he had seemed almost relieved to stop pretending. Yes, he had said simply. I've been seeing Kelsey for about 7 months. We have a connection that I haven't felt in a long time. She understands my world, speaks my language. We want the same things from life. And what do I want from life, Christopher? I had asked, genuinely curious about how he would characterize my desires and ambitions. He had looked at me with something resembling compassion, as if he felt sorry for me but also believed I needed to hear a difficult truth. You want security and comfort. You want someone to take care of you. There's nothing wrong with that, Vanessa, but it's not the same as the kind of partnership I need at this stage in my life. Kelsey is building her own career, making her own money, bringing her own value to the table beyond just being someone's wife. The assessment had been so reductive, so completely divorced from my actual interior life, that I had not even bothered to argue. What would be the point of explaining to Christopher that I had never wanted merely to be taken care of, that I had given up my career at his request, that the volunteer work and committee positions I filled were his suggestions for how I should spend my time? He had constructed a version of me that justified his choices, and nothing I said would penetrate that construction. The conversation about divorce had followed quickly after his admission of the affair. Christopher was nothing if not efficient. He had already consulted with his attorney, reviewed the prenuptial agreement, calculated what a dissolution would look like financially. He had approached ending our marriage with the same methodical planning he brought to structuring investment portfolios for his clients. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That morning in our kitchen, as he explained the terms of our separation with clinical precision, I felt something shift inside me. It was not anger exactly, though anger was certainly present beneath the surface. It was more like a clarifying recognition that I had been playing a game whose rules I had never fully understood, competing in a contest I did not know I had entered. Christopher continued his explanation of how our assets would be divided, or more accurately, how they would not be divided. The house in Paradise Valley, purchased entirely with his income, would remain his. The vacation condo in San Diego, also purchased with his earnings, belonged to him. The investment accounts, the retirement portfolios, the valuable art collection he had been building, all of it stayed with Christopher according to the terms of the prenuptial agreement. You'll keep your personal belongings, of course, he said with the magnanimous air of someone offering a generous concession. Your clothing, jewelry I gave you as gifts, your car. And naturally you'll take whatever was in your personal accounts when we married, though I imagine that's relatively modest. Relatively modest. The phrase hung in the air between us. When we had married, I'd had approximately $11,000 in savings, accumulated slowly during my years working at the gallery. That amount, adjusted for 6 years of sitting in a low-interest account, was what Christopher considered my fair share of a marriage that had consumed my 20s and early 30s. I will need to find somewhere to live, I said, keeping my voice neutral. The apartment I had rented before our marriage was long gone, filled years ago with new tenants living lives I could barely imagine now. Christopher nodded, as if he had already considered this logistical detail. I'll give you 60 days to make arrangements. That should be sufficient time to find something appropriate. I'm not trying to be cruel, Vanessa. I just think we both deserve to move forward with our lives. Our lives. As if we had been living parallel existences rather than a shared marriage. As if the past 6 years had been some kind of extended cohabitation arrangement rather than a legal and emotional partnership. What Christopher did not know What he could not possibly have known, because I myself had only learned it 3 weeks earlier, was that my relationship with my father had undergone a dramatic transformation in the final months of his life. Marcus Aldridge had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer the previous autumn. His prognosis had been grim from the start, measured in months rather than years. Faced with his mortality, he had apparently felt some urge to reconcile with the children he had abandoned decades ago. The first letter had arrived in late September, forwarded from my mother's address because Marcus apparently did not have my current contact information. The handwriting on the envelope had been shaky. The return address in Palo Alto, California. Inside was a 3-page letter written in the uncertain script of someone whose hands no longer fully obeyed their intentions. He had written about regret, about choices made and opportunities lost. He had tried to explain the failures and selfishness of his younger self, the ways he had prioritized his own comfort and new family over the children from his first marriage. He had not made excuses exactly, but he had attempted context, describing the overwhelming sense of failure he had felt in his first marriage, the way leaving had seemed like the only path forward at the time. The letter had concluded with a request to meet, to spend whatever time remained building some kind of relationship before it was too late. He wanted to know his daughter as an adult, to understand what kind of woman I had become, to offer whatever wisdom or support might still be meaningful after so many years of absence. I had not told Christopher about the letter. Some instinct I could not quite name had suggested that this developing relationship with my father should remain private, separate from the structures and dynamics of my marriage. I had written back to Marcus agreeing to meet, and we had begun a correspondence that gradually expanded from letters to phone calls to eventual visits. Marcus Aldridge had built a moderately successful technology company in the early days of Silicon Valley. He had sold it in the late 1990s for what was then considered a substantial sum, investing the proceeds wisely enough that his wealth had continued to grow over the subsequent decades. He lived modestly despite his resources, in a comfortable but not ostentatious home in Palo Alto, his second marriage having ended in divorce some years earlier. During my visits to California over those final months of his life, we had talked about everything. He had wanted to know about my education, my interests, my marriage. I had told him about the gallery work I had loved, the art history research that still fascinated me, the growing sense of disconnection I felt in my current life. He had listened with an attention I had never experienced from him before, asking thoughtful questions, remembering details from previous conversations. He had also shared his regrets about his relationship with Christopher, whom he had met only briefly at our wedding. "I never liked him," Marcus had said bluntly during one of our last conversations. "Too controlling, too focused on surfaces. You deserve someone who sees your actual value, not just how you reflect on their status." The comment had stung because it articulated something I had been trying not to acknowledge. But I had deflected, made excuses for Christopher's behavior, explained the pressures of his career, and the demands of his position. Marcus had simply nodded, clearly unconvinced but willing to let the subject drop. 3 weeks before Christopher announced his intention to divorce, Marcus Aldridge had died. The funeral had been small, attended by former colleagues and a few distant relatives. His second family, the children from his subsequent marriage, had been cordial but distant, clearly uncomfortable with the appearance of the daughter their father had essentially abandoned. I had felt like an intruder at the service, mourning a man I had only really known for a few months, grieving not just his death but all the years we might have had together if he had made different choices. The reading of the will had taken place a week after the funeral in the office of Marcus's attorney, a thoughtful man named Robert Chun who had worked with my father for over 20 years. The conference room had been filled with the people who expected to inherit portions of Marcus Aldridge's estate. His second wife, despite their divorce, had anticipated some provision. His children from that marriage had clearly expected to be primary beneficiaries. Various charities and organizations Marcus had supported were represented by hopeful development officers. Robert Chun had read through the document with professional composure, explaining various small bequests to individuals and organizations. Then he had reached the primary provision of the will, and his eyes had found mine across the conference table. "To my daughter, Vanessa Aldridge Hartwell, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including all financial accounts, real property, investment portfolios, and personal effects." This bequest is made in recognition of the years I failed her as a father and in hope that these resources might provide her with freedom and opportunities one denied her through my absence and neglect. The amount had been staggering. $156 million. Carefully invested and structured for tax efficiency. The number had seemed abstract, impossible, a figure from someone else's life accidentally applied to my own situation. Marcus's other children had been furious, threatening legal challenges and accusations of undue influence. His ex-wife had looked at me with undisguised hostility. I had sat in that conference room feeling numb, unable to process what had just happened. Robert Chun had assured me that the will was legally sound, that Marcus had been of completely sound mind when he had updated it several months before his death, that any challenge would be expensive and ultimately unsuccessful. He had also explained that the inheritance was mine individually, unencumbered by any claims Christopher might make through our marriage. The prenuptial agreement that protected Christopher's assets also protected mine. What I inherited independently belonged only to me. I had not told Christopher about the inheritance. The timing had been too strange, too convenient. I was still processing my grief over losing a father I had barely begun to know. I was trying to understand what this money meant and how it would change my life. And perhaps most honestly, some part of me had wanted to see what Christopher would do, how he would handle a divorce when he believed I had nothing and no one to support me. Now, standing in our kitchen as he explained how generously the prenuptial agreement would treat me, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Christopher thought he was dismantling my life, taking everything that mattered, leaving me to start over with essentially nothing. He had no idea that I was standing before him as one of the wealthiest women in Arizona, that the modest and dependent wife he was so confidently discarding had resources that dwarfed his own impressive portfolio. I will need to consult with my own attorney, I said quietly, to make sure I understand my rights and obligations. Christopher had nodded approvingly, as if I were a student who had finally grasped a difficult concept. That's very sensible, Vanessa. I want this to be handled properly and fairly. We can both move forward knowing everything was done correctly. Fairly. The word tasted bitter. But I simply nodded, poured his coffee into the Italian ceramic mug, and watched him head to his office to begin another day of managing other people's fortunes while having no idea of the magnitude of wealth that now belonged to his soon-to-be ex-wife. The weeks following Christopher's announcement of his intention to divorce were marked by a peculiar performance of normalcy. We continued to live in the same house, sleep in the same bed, and attend the same social functions we had committed to months earlier. The pretense required extraordinary discipline on both our parts, though for vastly different reasons. Christopher maintained appearances because his professional reputation depended on projecting stability and control. I maintained appearances because I needed time to prepare for what would come next. The Sanderson Foundation Gala fell on a Saturday evening in early March, one of those elaborate charity events that dominated the Phoenix social calendar. The foundation supported arts education in underfunded schools throughout the state, a cause that had once genuinely mattered to me before I understood that most attendees cared more about the networking opportunities than the actual charitable mission. Christopher had purchased a table for 12 at $5,000 per seat, filling it with his most important clients and their spouses. I dressed carefully that evening in a navy silk gown that Christopher had selected for me months earlier, before our marriage had officially entered its final stage. The dress was beautiful in an understated way, elegant without being attention-seeking, expensive without being ostentatious. It was exactly the kind of thing Christopher appreciated, clothing that communicated good taste and appropriate affluence without threatening to overshadow him. The event was held at the Phoenix Convention Center, transformed for the evening into a glittering space filled with elaborate floral arrangements and dramatic lighting. Round tables draped in ivory linens filled the ballroom, each centerpiece a towering construction of white orchids and trailing greenery that probably cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. A stage at the front of the room featured a podium where various speakers would eventually deliver carefully crafted remarks about the importance of arts education and the generosity of donors. Christopher worked the room with practiced ease, moving from table to table, shaking hands with men whose portfolios he managed and women whose husbands wrote the checks. I followed a half-step behind, smiling at appropriate moments, offering brief comments when directly addressed, otherwise maintaining the pleasant but unobtrusive presence that had become my signature at these events. Our table included Richard and Pamela Thornton, longtime clients whose family wealth derived from commercial real estate development across the Southwest. Richard was in his early 60s with silver hair, and the kind of deep tan that came from spending significant time on golf courses and tennis courts. Pamela was his second wife, a former yoga instructor who had successfully positioned herself as a wellness influencer among Phoenix's wealthy set. They were pleasant enough people, superficial in the way that characterized most of Christopher's social circle. Also seated at our table were James and Monica Chan, relatively new clients who had recently sold their medical device company for a sum substantial enough to require sophisticated wealth management. James was quiet and analytical, clearly more comfortable in laboratory settings than social gatherings. Monica compensated with effusive warmth, talking constantly about their children's achievements and their plans for a second home in Sedona. The remaining seats were filled by two other client couples whose names I barely registered, and Kelsey Brennan, seated directly across from me in a red dress that hugged her figure in ways that my conservative navy gown deliberately avoided. Her presence at our table was a calculated provocation, Christopher's way of demonstrating that he no longer felt obligated to hide his relationship or protect my feelings. She smiled at me with false sympathy, her eyes communicating triumph barely disguised as concern. Dinner was served in courses that arrived with geometric precision, each plate arranged like a small work of art that would be disassembled and consumed within minutes. I pushed food around my plate, participating minimally in the conversation swirling around the table. The discussion centered on market conditions, investment strategies, and complaints about proposed tax legislation that might reduce the benefits of certain charitable giving structures. Between the main course and dessert, the Foundation's executive director took the stage to deliver remarks about the organization's impact. She shared statistics about how many students had been reached, how many schools had received support, how many young lives had been changed through exposure to visual arts, music, and theater. The audience applauded politely, already thinking about dessert and the afterparty at a nearby hotel where the real networking would happen. Then the executive director introduced a student speaker, a 16-year-old girl named Maria, who had participated in a foundation-sponsored program at her high school. Maria walked to the podium with visible nervousness, her hands clutching index cards covered with notes. She began speaking about what art classes had meant to her, how learning to paint had given her a way to process her experience as the daughter of immigrants, how creating visual narratives had helped her understand her own identity. Her voice gained strength as she spoke, describing the teacher who had encouraged her, the supplies the foundation had provided, the field trip to the Phoenix Art Museum where she had seen original paintings that had previously existed only in textbook photographs. She talked about planning to study art history in college, about wanting to work in museums, so that she could help other young people access the transformative power of art. I found myself listening with unexpected emotion, recognizing in Maria's words something of my own younger self. I had been that girl once, passionate about art, convinced that studying beauty and creativity mattered as much as more pragmatic pursuits. I had wanted to work in museums, to spend my life surrounded by objects that represented human imagination and skill across centuries and cultures. Somehow I had ended up here, sitting at a table of people who viewed art primarily as an investment class or a tax deduction strategy. When Maria finished her remarks and returned to her seat, the applause was genuine but brief. The audience was ready to move on to the next portion of the program. But I continued thinking about her words, about the path that had brought me from passionate graduate student to ornamental wife to whatever I was becoming now. Christopher leaned toward Kelsey during the dessert course, speaking quietly enough that I could not hear the specific words but loudly enough that his intimate tone was unmistakable. She laughed at something he said, touching his arm in a gesture of casual affection that communicated ownership. Pamela Thornton noticed the interaction, her eyes flicking between Christopher, Kelsey, and me with obvious interest. This would be gossip by morning, whispered over coffee at the country club, and shared during personal training sessions. After dinner, as guests began circulating again, Christopher excused himself to speak with a potential client he had spotted across the room. Kelsey followed him like a satellite locked in orbit, her red dress visible across the ballroom as they moved from conversation to conversation. I remained at the table, sipping champagne I did not want and watching the social dynamics play out around me. Richard Thornton slid into the seat Christopher had vacated. positioning himself closer than was strictly necessary. He smelled of expensive cologne and the whiskey he had been drinking throughout dinner. I braced myself for whatever conversation was coming, recognizing the particular expression men wore when they felt entitled to offer unsolicited advice or commentary. "Vanessa," he began, his voice carrying the false intimacy of someone who had drunk just enough to believe himself profound. "I hope you will not take this the wrong way, but I feel I should say something as someone who has known you and Christopher for several years now." I waited, giving him nothing, unwilling to make this easier by pretending I welcomed his observations. "Marriage is a partnership," he continued, undeterred by my silence. "Both parties need to bring value to the table. Christopher is at a critical stage in his career, managing substantial portfolios, making decisions that affect generational wealth. He needs a partner who understands that world, who can operate at that level." He paused, perhaps expecting me to argue or defend myself. When I remained quiet, he pressed forward with the kind of certainty that comes from never having been genuinely challenged. "You are a lovely woman, Vanessa, cultured and well-educated. But there is a difference between being accomplished and being ambitious. Christopher needs someone who is building something of their own, not just supporting his work from the sidelines. Kelsey is a rising star at the firm, bringing in her own clients, developing her own expertise. That is the kind of partnership that works at this level." I looked at Richard Thornton directly, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time despite years of social interactions. He was a man who had inherited his initial wealth, married up twice to access additional resources and connections, and genuinely believed his success was the result of his own exceptional capabilities rather than fortunate circumstances. He was offering me what he considered wisdom, completely unaware of his own mediocrity. "Richard," I said quietly, my voice calm despite the anger burning beneath my sternum, "I appreciate your concern, but I suspect you have misunderstood the situation rather significantly." His eyebrows raised slightly, surprised that I was responding with anything other than humble gratitude for his insights. I continued, choosing my words carefully. "You see me as someone who has failed to bring sufficient value to my marriage. You look at Kelsey and see ambition and professional accomplishment. Those are not inaccurate observations, but they rest on incomplete information about what actually constitutes value and success." Before Richard could respond, Pamela appeared at his elbow, clearly having noticed her husband's inappropriate proximity to another woman at a public event. She smiled tightly at both of us, threading her arm through Richard's with the possessive firmness of someone who had learned to guard her territory. "Richard was just offering some perspective on modern marriage," I said to Pamela, my tone light. "He believes professional ambition is the most important quality a spouse can offer." Pamela's smile became even more strained. "Richard has always had strong opinions about how other people should live their lives," she said with an edge that suggested marital tensions of their own. "I often remind him that advice is most useful when it has been requested." She steered her husband away from the table, leaving me alone again with my champagne and my thoughts. Across the room, I could see Christopher and Kelsey in animated conversation with a couple I recognized as prospective clients. Christopher's hand rested on the small of Kelsey's back in a gesture that communicated partnership and intimacy. They looked right together in a way that Christopher and I apparently never had, at least not according to people like Richard Thornton, who measured compatibility in terms of professional trajectory and social positioning. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of superficial conversations and strained smiles. I spoke with Monica Chun about her daughter's college search, commiserated with another wife about the challenges of finding good household help, and listened to a real estate developer explain his vision for a luxury resort development near Tucson. Every interaction felt like a performance I was growing increasingly tired of sustaining. We left the gala shortly after 10, Christopher driving his Mercedes with Kelsey in the passenger seat, while I followed in my own car. He had suggested this arrangement earlier in the week, explaining that it would be easier if we arrived and departed separately given our changed circumstances. The symbolism was obvious and intentional. Even our transportation communicated the dissolution of our partnership. The drive back to Paradise Valley took 20 minutes through quiet streets lined with homes worth millions of dollars. I followed Christopher's taillights, watching Kelsey's profile visible through the rear window, her hand occasionally reaching toward Christopher in gestures I could only imagine. When we arrived at the house, Christopher walked Kelsey to her car. which was parked in our circular driveway. They stood talking for several minutes before embracing in a kiss that was clearly visible to anyone who might be watching. I walked past them without acknowledgement, letting myself into the house we still technically shared. I went directly to my private study, a small room off the main bedroom that Christopher had designated as my space when we first moved into the house. It was the only room in the entire estate that reflected my actual taste, rather than the designer's vision. Books lined floor-to-ceiling shelves, art history monographs and exhibition catalogs I had collected over years. A comfortable reading chair sat near the window overlooking the desert landscape. My laptop occupied a simple desk where I handled whatever correspondence and planning my limited responsibilities required. I opened my laptop and pulled up the encrypted email account I had established for communications with my father's estate attorney. Robert Chun had been helping me understand the full scope of my inheritance and develop strategies for managing wealth on a scale I had never imagined. He had connected me with other professionals, tax advisors and investment managers and legal specialists who could help structure my assets in ways that protected them and maximized their long-term growth. There was a new message from Robert with the subject line, Estate Settlement Final Documentation. I opened it to find confirmation that all legal challenges from my father's other heirs had been resolved, that the assets had been successfully transferred into my name, and that the various trusts and structures we had discussed were now fully operational. The inheritance was officially, legally, irrevocably mine. Attached to the email was a detailed financial summary showing the current value of my holdings. The number had grown in the months since my father's death, market appreciation adding millions to the initial bequest. I stared at the figure on my screen, trying to make it feel real rather than abstract. $158,400,000. My net worth had increased by more than $2 million simply through passive investment returns, while I sat at charity galas and pretended to care about Christopher's opinions. A knock on my study door interrupted my thoughts. Christopher entered without waiting for permission, still wearing his tuxedo from the evening though he had removed his bow tie. He looked tired suddenly, older than his 41 years, the strain of maintaining multiple performances finally showing on his face. "We need to talk about timing," he said, not bothering with preamble or small talk. "My attorney thinks we should file the paperwork within the next 2 weeks. The sooner we initiate the process, the sooner we can both move forward." I closed my laptop, giving him my full attention. "What exactly does moving forward look like from your perspective?" He sat in the chair across from my desk, crossing his legs in a posture of casual confidence. "I will buy out your interest in any joint property, though given the prenup there is not much that qualifies. You will need to find your own housing, obviously. I am willing to give you 90 days rather than 60 if that helps with your planning. I am not trying to put you on the street, Vanessa. I just think we both recognize this marriage has run its course. And Kelsey," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "How does she factor into your forward movement?" Christopher had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable, but he recovered quickly. "Kelsey and I have been getting to know each other over the past several months. We have a strong connection both personally and professionally. She understands my world in ways that you never really could. Because she works in finance," I said. "Because she speaks the language of wealth management and investment strategy." "Exactly." Christopher seemed relieved that I understood this point. "It is not a criticism of you, Vanessa. You have your own interests and strengths. But at this stage in my career, I need a partner who can engage with my work at a sophisticated level, who brings her own professional credibility and client relationships. Kelsey and I can build something together that is genuinely collaborative." I nodded slowly, absorbing his words and the worldview they revealed. Christopher measured partnership in terms of professional utility and networking value. He needed a wife who enhanced his career prospects and social positioning, rather than someone who simply loved him or shared his life. By his metrics, I had indeed failed to provide adequate value. I had not brought clients to his firm or impressed his colleagues with my own professional achievements. I had simply existed adjacent to his success, decorative but ultimately dispensable. "What do you think I will do after our divorce?" I asked, genuinely curious about his assessment of my prospects. "Where do you imagine I will go and how do you think I will support myself?" Christopher considered the question with the same analytical attention he brought to client portfolios. I imagine you will find a modest apartment somewhere in Tempe or Phoenix, probably near your mother. You might return to museum work, though positions in that field are limited and do not pay well. You could teach art history at a community college perhaps, supplement your income with continued volunteer work. You will have to adjust your lifestyle significantly, but you are still young enough to rebuild. His tone throughout this assessment was not cruel, merely practical. He was offering what he considered a realistic appraisal of my situation, helping me understand what I needed to plan for as a divorced woman with limited financial resources, and a resume showing years away from professional work. He genuinely believed he was being helpful, giving me clarity about the challenges ahead, so I could prepare appropriately. You have thought about this quite a bit, I observed. Of course. I do not make major decisions without thorough analysis. He stood, preparing to leave my study and return to whatever else he had planned for the evening. I know this is difficult, Vanessa, but in the long run you will see that I am doing you a favor. You will be free to find someone more suited to your interests and lifestyle. Someone who appreciates the things you care about rather than someone who needs a partner who can operate in high-level financial circles. He left the study, closing the door behind him with a soft click that felt somehow final. I sat in my chair, surrounded by my books and the inheritance documents still open on my laptop screen, and felt something crystallize inside me. Christopher had just explained to me exactly how little he understood about my actual worth, my actual capabilities, my actual resources. He had revealed the profound limitations of his own perception, while believing he was offering sophisticated insight into reality. I thought about Richard Thornton's dinner conversation, his unsolicited advice about the importance of professional ambition and partnership value. I thought about Kelsey Brennan in her red dress, confident that her financial credentials and rising career made her more valuable than the woman she was replacing. I thought about all the social events where I had been introduced as Christopher's wife who used to work in museums, the past tense always emphasized to indicate I had moved beyond that modest phase into the more appropriate role of supporting spouse. They had all made the same fundamental error. They had assessed me based on visible markers and conventional assumptions, never questioning whether their information was complete or their analysis accurate. Christopher knew I had worked at a gallery making modest income. He knew I had inherited nothing from my father during our marriage. He knew I had no obvious professional prospects or independent wealth. From these data points, he had constructed a narrative about my worth and my future that felt comprehensive to him but was actually profoundly incomplete. What none of them knew, what they could not know because I had deliberately kept it private, was that I was sitting on a fortune that exceeded the combined net worth of everyone at our dinner table that evening. My father's inheritance had made me wealthier than Christopher would likely ever be despite his successful career and careful investment strategies. The modest future Christopher had sketched for me, teaching at community colleges and living in small apartments, existed only in his imagination. My actual future looked nothing like his projection. I opened my laptop again and composed a brief email to Robert Chen. I am ready to move forward with all the planning we discussed. Please coordinate with the divorce attorney you recommended, and ensure that all structures are in place to protect my assets throughout this process. I expect my husband will file paperwork within the next 2 weeks. I want to be prepared for every possibility. I hit send and closed the laptop with a sense of calm purpose. The performance of being Christopher's struggling ex-wife would continue for as long as necessary. I would allow him and everyone in his circle to believe exactly what they wanted to believe about my limited prospects and reduced circumstances. And when the truth eventually emerged, when they discovered that the woman they had dismissed and pitted was actually wealthier than they had imagined possible, I would watch them recalibrate their entire understanding of value and worth and success. The late March sun was setting over Camelback Mountain, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded me why I had fallen in love with Arizona in the first place. I stood at my study window watching the light change, thinking about Maria, the student speaker from the gala. She had spoken about art giving her tools to understand her own identity and claim her own narrative. I was doing something similar, I realized. I was reclaiming my story from people who had tried to tell it for me, who had decided they knew who I was and what I was capable of based on incomplete information and their own limited imaginations. Christopher's voice drifted up from downstairs, talking on the phone with someone about client portfolio adjustments and market repositioning. He sounded confident and in control, a man who had made difficult but necessary decisions and was now moving efficiently toward a better future. He had no idea that the future he was planning would look nothing like what he imagined, that the variables in his careful analysis were about to shift in ways that would invalidate all his assumptions. I smiled slightly, feeling something very close to peace despite the chaos of my dissolving marriage. Let Christopher file his divorce papers and waive his prenuptial agreement, and explain to anyone who would listen how generous he was being with the wife who had failed to bring sufficient value to their partnership. Let Richard Thornton and his friends offer their unsolicited wisdom about modern marriage and professional ambition. Let Kelsey Brennan believe that her credentials and career made her more worthy of Christopher's attention and resources. They would all learn soon enough that worth and value and success were more complicated than they imagined, that visible markers told incomplete stories, and that the quiet woman they had dismissed had been building something they had never bothered to look for. The law offices of Margaretchen occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower in downtown Phoenix, with views extending across the valley to the mountains that ring the city. I had scheduled the appointment for a Tuesday morning in early April, telling Christopher I had a dentist appointment and would be gone for several hours. The deception felt necessary given what I needed to discuss and the strategies I needed to develop. Margaret Chun was Robert Chen's sister, though their professional paths had diverged dramatically after law school. While Robert had built his practice around estate planning and wealth management for technology entrepreneurs in California, Margaret had become one of Arizona's most formidable divorce attorneys. She had a reputation for representing women in high-asset divorces, particularly cases where prenuptial agreements seemed to favor husbands who had underestimated their wives. She met me in a conference room decorated with understated elegance, her handshake firm and her gaze direct. Robert had briefed her on the broad outlines of my situation, though she wanted to hear the details directly from me. I spent 90 minutes walking her through my marriage to Christopher, the prenuptial agreement I had signed at 23, his current demands for divorce, and most importantly, the inheritance from my father that Christopher knew nothing about. Margaret listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad in handwriting so precise it looked almost mechanical. When I finished my narrative, she sat back in her leather chair and regarded me with an expression that combined professional assessment with something approaching admiration. "Your husband has made several critical miscalculations," she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had navigated hundreds of similar cases. "The prenuptial agreement he is relying on so heavily actually works entirely in your favor under these circumstances. The same provisions that protect his premarital assets and his earnings during the marriage also protect your inheritance completely. He cannot make any claim whatsoever to the money from your father's estate." I nodded, having already understood this basic principle from my conversations with Robert. But I wanted to hear Margaret's strategic thinking about how to handle the revelation of my financial situation. "The question before us," Margaret continued, "is one of timing and presentation. We could disclose your inheritance immediately as part of the initial divorce proceedings. This would be the most straightforward approach and would certainly shock your husband and his attorney. However, it would also alert him to your resources before we have fully understood his own financial situation, and before he has committed to specific positions that might later embarrass him." She paused, allowing me to consider the implications of what she was suggesting. "Alternatively, we could allow your husband to proceed under his current assumptions. Let him file his divorce petition. Let him present his proposed settlement based on the prenuptial agreement. Let him make public statements about the division of assets. Once he has committed to these positions both legally and socially, we disclose your inheritance. The impact would be considerably more dramatic, and would leave him in a position where he has already revealed his true character and intentions to everyone who matters in his professional and social circles." The strategic calculation was clear, but it required me to continue the performance of being the disadvantaged spouse for potentially months. I would need to allow Christopher and his attorney to treat me as someone with minimal resources and limited options. I would need to let them believe their assessment of my situation was accurate even as I knew it to be profoundly wrong. "How long would this strategy require?" I asked. "How long would I need to maintain the pretense before disclosure became appropriate?" Margaret considered the question carefully. A typical high-asset divorce in Arizona takes anywhere from 6 to 18 months depending on complexity and cooperation between parties. Your case is actually quite simple from a legal standpoint given the prenuptial agreement. I would estimate we could be finalized within 4 to 6 months if both parties are motivated to move quickly. Christopher clearly wants this divorce to happen rapidly, so he can move forward with his new relationship. We can use that urgency to our advantage." She leaned forward, her expression becoming more intense. "Here is what I recommend. We allow Christopher to file his petition and serve you with divorce papers. We respond appropriately but do not contest the basic terms he proposes since the prenuptial agreement is actually favorable to you. We go through the normal discovery process where both parties disclose financial information. You disclose your inheritance at that point as legally required, but it happens as part of standard paperwork rather than a dramatic announcement." And then I said, understanding where her strategy was leading. "And then we wait for the realization to occur. Christopher will see the financial disclosures. His attorney will certainly notice a line item showing assets of over $150 million. They will investigate to confirm the information is accurate. And then they will understand what has happened. Your husband will realize that while he was planning to cast aside his wife for someone with better professional credentials and higher earning potential, that wife was sitting on a fortune that exceeds anything he will likely accumulate in his lifetime." The satisfaction in Margaret's voice suggested she had orchestrated similar revelations before and found them professionally rewarding. I understood the appeal of her strategy, but I also recognized the emotional cost it would require. Allowing Christopher to continue treating me as someone of negligible worth, permitting his friends and colleagues to pity my reduced circumstances, maintaining the fiction of struggling to rebuild my life while knowing the truth of my actual situation would demand extraordinary discipline. "There is another consideration," Margaret added. "Your husband's relationship with this other woman, Kelsey Brennan. Part of what makes him feel confident about leaving you is his belief that he is trading up to a more valuable partner. If we disclose your inheritance early in the process, he might try to salvage his relationship with you once he understands your actual net worth. He might attempt reconciliation not out of genuine feeling but out of financial calculation." The thought was repulsive, but I recognized its plausibility. Christopher made decisions based on analysis of costs and benefits. If he understood that I commanded resources far exceeding what Kelsey could bring to a marriage, he might very well reconsider his choice regardless of his emotional attachment to her. By allowing him to proceed under his current assumptions, I ensured that his divorce from me was based on what he genuinely wanted rather than what financial analysis suggested he should want. "I want him to make his choice freely," I said to Margaret. "I want there to be no question that he selected Kelsey over me based on his authentic assessment of what he valued. When he eventually learns about my inheritance, I want him to understand that he walked away from something extraordinary because he was too limited in his thinking to recognize what was right in front of him." Margaret smiled with genuine warmth. "Then we proceed with strategic patience. We let your husband show everyone exactly who he is and what he values. We let him commit fully to his chosen path. And when the truth emerges, we let him live with the consequences of his own poor judgment and incomplete analysis." We spent another hour discussing practical details and legal procedures. Margaret explained the timeline for filing responses to divorce petitions, the discovery process where financial information would be exchanged, and the eventual settlement conference where final terms would be agreed upon. She assured me that the prenuptial agreement was ironclad, and that Christopher would have no legal basis to claim any portion of my inheritance regardless of when it was disclosed. As I prepared to leave her office, Margaret offered one final observation. "Your husband believes he is the sophisticated one in this relationship," she said. "He thinks his professional expertise in managing money makes him superior to you with your art history degree and museum aspirations. But true sophistication is not about managing other people's wealth or understanding market dynamics. It is about understanding human nature, recognizing value that others miss, and having the patience and discipline to let situations develop according to their own logic, rather than forcing premature resolutions." The comment stayed with me as I drove back to Paradise Valley. Christopher had always positioned himself as the strategic thinker in our marriage, the one who understood how the world actually worked while I remained focused on impractical pursuits like art and beauty. But what was I doing now if not engaging in sophisticated strategy, thinking several moves ahead, understanding how information and timing could be deployed for maximum effect? I stopped at a Target on my way home and purchased items that would support the narrative I was building. Inexpensive towels and kitchen supplies, the kind of basic household goods someone would need if they were preparing to move into a modest apartment. I loaded the shopping bags visibly into my car, knowing that Christopher might see them when I arrived home. Every detail contributed to the larger performance. Christopher was in his home office when I returned, on a video call with clients whose faces I could see on his large monitor. I walked past without disturbing him, carrying my Target bags upstairs to my study. I stowed the purchases in a closet where they would remain as props for the eventual move I would need to stage. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Are you free for lunch this week? I miss you and we need to catch up." I smiled at the message, appreciating her intuition that something significant was happening even though I had not shared details about either my failing marriage or my inheritance. My mother had always possessed an uncanny ability to sense when her children needed her attention. I texted back confirming lunch for Thursday, suggesting a small Italian restaurant in Tempe, near where she lived. The location was important because it signaled that I was spending more time in areas I might realistically move to after the divorce, establishing patterns that would support the broader narrative. The following morning, Christopher informed me that his attorney had completed the divorce petition and would be filing it with the court that afternoon. He presented this information over breakfast, speaking in the same tone he might use to report that he had scheduled a routine maintenance appointment for his car. The paperwork would be served to me formally within a few days, he explained, but he wanted me to know it was happening so I would not be caught off guard. "I appreciate you telling me," I said, keeping my voice neutral and my expression composed. "I have consulted with an attorney as well. We will review whatever documents are served and respond appropriately." Christopher looked faintly surprised that I had already secured legal representation. I suspect he had assumed I would struggle to find adequate counsel, or perhaps try to navigate the divorce without professional help in order to save money. The fact that I had been proactive suggested a level of preparation he had not anticipated. "Who are you working with?" he asked, his tone shifting to something more guarded. "Margaret Chen. She was recommended by someone who knows my situation." Christopher's eyebrows rose slightly. Margaret Chen was a significant choice. Her reputation in Phoenix legal circles meant that he could not dismiss her as some cut-rate attorney I had found through desperate searching. She was expensive and highly skilled, which raised the question of how I was paying for her services. I saw him calculating, trying to understand whether my mother had somehow helped me secure representation, or whether Margaret had agreed to defer her fees until settlement. What he did not know was that I had already paid Margaret a substantial retainer from my inheritance, ensuring that I had the best possible representation without any financial constraints. Robert Chun had connected me with private bankers who had established accounts and structures that allowed me to access my inheritance for necessary expenses, while keeping the full scope of my wealth private, until the strategic moment of disclosure. The divorce petition arrived via process server on a Saturday morning. Christopher had deliberately arranged for the service to occur at the house, perhaps believing that having documents delivered to our shared residence would be less humiliating for me than being served at some other location. The server was professional and efficient, handing me a manila envelope and asking me to sign a form confirming receipt. I opened the envelope alone in my study, reading through the legal language that formally dissolved our marriage. The petition described our relationship in the coldest possible terms. Irreconcilable differences had made the marriage irretrievably broken. No minor children existed to complicate custody arrangements. A prenuptial agreement governed the division of property and assets. The petitioner requested that the court enforce the terms of said prenuptial agreement and grant the dissolution of marriage. Attached to the petition were Christopher's financial disclosures, detailed accounting of his assets and income as required by Arizona law. I reviewed the numbers with interest, seeing the full scope of his wealth laid out explicitly for the first time. The house in Paradise Valley was valued at $3.2 million with a mortgage of $700,000 remaining. The San Diego condo was worth $800,000 with no mortgage. His investment accounts totaled approximately $4.6 million across various holdings. His annual income from the wealth management firm averaged $680,000. By conventional standards, Christopher was quite successful. He had accumulated nearly $8 million in net worth by his early 40s through a combination of professional income and careful investing. It was genuinely impressive for someone who had started with modest family resources and built wealth through his own career rather than inheritance or family business. Under normal circumstances, divorcing Christopher would mean walking away from access to substantial resources and facing a dramatically reduced standard of living. But my circumstances were not normal. My inheritance was nearly 20 times larger than Christopher's entire net worth. The passive investment returns on my assets exceeded his annual income. I was not the disadvantaged party in this divorce despite all appearances and assumptions. I was actually in a position of such overwhelming financial superiority that the prenuptial agreement he was using to protect his assets looked almost quaint in its focus on amounts that no longer mattered. I photographed every page of Christopher's financial disclosures and sent them to Margaret Chun through our encrypted communication system. She responded within hours with her initial analysis. His numbers appear accurate based on what we can verify independently. He is not hiding assets or attempting to minimize his wealth. This suggests he genuinely believes he is in a position of strength and has no reason to be concerned about your potential claims. This works entirely to our advantage. Over the following week, I worked with Margaret to prepare my responsive financial disclosures. The documents required me to list all assets, income sources, debts, and financial obligations. For most divorcing spouses, this was a straightforward if somewhat tedious exercise. For me, it meant creating the documentation that would eventually shatter Christopher's entire understanding of our relative positions. Margaret and I discussed how to present the inheritance information clearly, but without unnecessary elaboration. The disclosure forms had a line for investment accounts and assets. I listed the various trusts and structures that held my father's estate with their current values. The total appeared on the summary page as a single number that would be impossible to overlook. $158,400,000. We filed my responsive pleadings and financial disclosures on a Tuesday morning in late April. The documents were served on Christopher's attorney by courier, standard practice for divorce proceedings. Margaret estimated it would take anywhere from a few hours to a full day before Christopher or his attorney actually reviewed the financial disclosures with enough attention to notice the inheritance. I spent that day engaged in deliberately normal activities. I had coffee with a former colleague from my museum days who was visiting Phoenix. I went to a yoga class at a studio I had been attending sporadically throughout my marriage. I stopped at Whole Foods to purchase groceries for meals I would prepare in the house I still shared with Christopher. Every action reinforced the appearance of someone going through the difficult but manageable process of dissolving a marriage and preparing to rebuild a modest life. Christopher called me at 4:30 that afternoon. I was in my study, ostensibly reading a book about Renaissance sculpture, but actually checking my phone obsessively for any indication that the disclosure had been reviewed. When his name appeared on my screen, my heart rate accelerated despite my efforts to remain calm. I answered with studied casualness. "Hello, Christopher." There was a long pause before he spoke. His voice when it came sounded strained in a way I had never heard before. "We need to talk. In person. Can you meet me at the house?" "I am at the house," I replied. "I have been here all afternoon." Another pause. "I am leaving the office now. I will be there in 20 minutes. Please do not go anywhere." He ended the call without waiting for my response. I sat in my study listening to my own breathing and the distant sound of traffic on the roads below our hillside property. This was the moment Margaret and I had anticipated. Christopher had seen the financial disclosures. He had processed the numbers with whatever combination of shock and disbelief the revelation had produced. And now he was racing home to confront me with questions I had been preparing to answer for weeks. I went downstairs to the living room and positioned myself on the sofa where I would be visible from the entrance. I wanted Christopher to see me immediately when he entered, wanted him to observe my calm composure in the face of his agitation. The performance required me to appear neither defensive nor triumphant, simply matter-of-fact about information I had always possessed but had not seen any reason to volunteer. Christopher arrived in 18 minutes rather than 20, his Mercedes pulling into the driveway with enough speed that the tires squealed slightly. He burst through the front door still carrying his briefcase, His tie loosened and his expression wild in a way that made him look almost unfamiliar. He stopped when he saw me sitting calmly on the sofa, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to formulate the question he needed to ask. $158 million, he finally said. Your financial disclosure shows assets of $158 million. That cannot possibly be accurate. It has to be an error. Some kind of mistake in the paperwork. I regarded him steadily, keeping my voice level and informational. It is not an error. The amount is accurate. I inherited my father's estate approximately 4 months ago. The value at the time of transfer was $156 million. Market appreciation since then has increased the total to its current level. Christopher walked further into the room but did not sit. He began pacing in front of the windows, his agitation expressing itself in restless movement. Your father, Marcus Aldrich, the man who was barely in your life, the man you said you had no relationship with. I had no relationship with him for most of my life, I corrected. That changed during the final months before his death. We reconciled. He updated his will. He left me his estate. The words were simple but their impact on Christopher was visible. His face cycled through expressions of shock, confusion, anger, and something that might have been grief or might have been simple calculation about what this meant for his own position. You never told me, he said, his voice rising. We were married. We lived together. You were in contact with your father, visiting him, building a relationship, and you never mentioned any of it. I maintained my calm exterior though my heart was pounding. You were very busy with work during that period. You were traveling frequently. You made it clear that my family relationships were not particularly interesting to you. That is not the point. Christopher's hands clenched into fists at his sides. This is about honesty. About transparency. We were supposed to be partners and you hid something this enormous from me. The accusation hung in the air between us. I let it sit for a moment before responding, wanting him to hear his own words and perhaps recognize their irony given that he had been concealing an affair and planning a divorce while accusing me of insufficient transparency. Christopher, I said quietly, you were sleeping with Kelsey Brennan. You were planning to divorce me. You were making arrangements to remove me from your life, because I did not bring sufficient value to our partnership. In what sense were we operating as honest partners who owed each other complete transparency about our personal and financial situations? He stopped pacing, staring at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. The affair with Kelsey started after your father died. After you had already inherited this money. You were sitting on a fortune while I was evaluating our marriage and you said nothing. I stood up from the sofa, wanting to meet him at eye level. You were evaluating our marriage based on your assessment that I had nothing to offer beyond being your wife. You decided I was not sufficiently ambitious or professionally accomplished. You concluded that Kelsey with her financial credentials and rising career represented a better partnership. None of that analysis would have changed if you had known about my inheritance. You were not falling out of love with me because of my bank balance. You were falling out of love with me because you found someone you believed was more compatible with your values and goals. But $158 million changes everything, he said, almost pleading now. That kind of money, that level of resources, we could build something extraordinary together. The firm could expand. I could take on larger clients. We could be one of the most powerful couples in Phoenix. There it was. The truth that had always existed beneath the surface of our marriage. Christopher did not value me for who I was but for what I could contribute to his ambitions and his image. When he believed I contributed little, he discarded me without hesitation. Now that he understood I commanded enormous resources, he wanted to reconsider. His feelings followed his financial calculations rather than existing independent of them. I walked toward the windows, looking out at the desert landscape turning gold in the late afternoon sun. Christopher, I said without turning around, the divorce petition has been filed. My financial disclosures have been submitted. The process is underway. I think we should allow it to continue to its natural conclusion. We can withdraw the petition, he said urgently. Couples change their minds. We can tell people we work through our difficulties. No one has to know about Kelsey. We can just move forward together. I finally turned to face him. Everyone already knows about Kelsey. You brought her to the Sanderson Gala. You posted photographs with her on social media. Your colleagues have seen you together. The narrative is already established. You left your wife for a younger woman with better professional credentials. Trying to reverse that story now would make you look calculating and mercenary rather than simply misguided. Christopher sank into a chair, his earlier agitation giving way to what looked like genuine despair. I made a mistake. I did not understand the full situation. If I had known about your inheritance, I never would have pursued a divorce. Exactly, I said. If you had known about my money, you would have stayed married to me regardless of your feelings. You would have suppressed your relationship with Kelsey and maintained our marriage as a business arrangement that served your interests. That is not a relationship I want to be part of, Christopher. I would rather be alone with my resources than partnered with someone who only values me for my financial contribution to his ambitions. He looked up at me with an expression I could not quite read. What happens now? Now we proceed with the divorce under the terms of the prenuptial agreement that you insisted upon. You keep your assets. I keep mine. We divide nothing because we built nothing together except an illusion that has now been thoroughly dispelled. You move forward with Kelsey and your vision of the partnership that suits your current needs. I move forward with my own plans that do not require your participation or approval. Christopher sat in silence for a long moment before standing and walking toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back one final time. You must hate me. For how I treated you, for what I said about your value and your prospects. You must take real satisfaction in this reversal. I considered his statement carefully before responding. I do not hate you, Christopher. Pity you. You had something genuine and you could not recognize it because you were too focused on measuring worth in terms that miss everything that actually matters. You are going to spend the rest of your life managing other people's money and wondering what would have happened if you had been capable of seeing value that was not obvious on a spreadsheet. He left without responding, the door closing behind him with a soft click that felt like punctuation at the end of a very long sentence. I stood in our living room, surrounded by furniture and art that had never really been mine, and felt something very close to joy. Not because I had hurt Christopher or demonstrated my superiority, but because I had finally stopped performing a role in someone else's narrative and begun writing my own story according to my own values and understanding of what mattered. The weeks following Christopher's discovery of my inheritance brought a strange new dynamic to our shared living situation. We continued to occupy the same house while the divorce proceeded through its legal phases, but the power balance between us had fundamentally shifted in ways that manifested in countless small interactions. Christopher moved through the space with visible discomfort, no longer the confident master of his domain but rather someone who had made a catastrophic error in judgment and was now forced to live with the daily reminder of his miscalculation. I maintained my carefully constructed public persona despite Christopher's new understanding of my actual circumstances. The performance was no longer necessary to deceive him, but it remained essential for managing how the broader social and professional community would perceive the dissolution of our marriage. Margaret Chun had explained the strategic value of controlling the narrative, of allowing Christopher's friends and colleagues to form opinions based on incomplete information that would later be dramatically revised when the full truth emerged. The Phoenix Professional Women's Luncheon fell on the second Thursday of May, an event I had committed to attending months earlier when the calendar seemed distant and my marriage still intact. The luncheon was held at the Arizona Biltmore, one of those historic resort properties where Phoenix's established families had been gathering for generations. The event drew several hundred women from across the valley, a mix of corporate executives, nonprofit leaders, entrepreneurs, and the wives of prominent men who occupied their time with volunteer leadership and social coordination. I dressed in a simple linen dress from Nordstrom Rack, deliberately choosing something attractive but noticeably less expensive than what I would have worn to similar events during the height of my marriage. The shift in my presentation was subtle but intentional. My jewelry was understated, my handbag came from a mid-range brand rather than a luxury designer. My shoes were elegant but purchased on sale. Every detail communicated careful budgeting and reduced circumstances without appearing actually impoverished. The ballroom was arranged with round tables seating 8, each covered in crisp white linens and decorated with spring flower arrangements that probably cost more than many attendees spent on groceries in a week. I found my assigned table and recognized several of the women already seated. Patricia Valdez worked in commercial real estate development and had always been friendly in a professional but distant way. Susan Montgomery ran a successful interior design firm, and had decorated several homes in my social circle. The other women at the table were less familiar, though I recognized them from various charity events and social gatherings over the years. The conversation before the formal program began centered on the usual topics that dominated these gatherings: children's college selections and athletic achievements, vacation properties being renovated or newly acquired, upcoming charity galas, and the challenge of securing desirable auction items. I participated minimally, offering brief comments when directly addressed but otherwise allowing the conversation to flow around me. Susan Montgomery eventually turned her attention to me with the kind of studied casualness that suggested she had been waiting for an appropriate opening. "Vanessa, I heard that you and Christopher are going through a separation. I am so sorry. Divorce is never easy, even when it is the right choice." Her tone carried genuine sympathy mixed with unmistakable curiosity. The news of our divorce had circulated through social networks with the speed that characterized any significant change in status among Phoenix's interconnected professional and social communities. People were hungry for details, eager to understand what had happened, and to position themselves appropriately relative to the unfolding drama. "Thank you," I replied, keeping my voice steady and my expression neutral. "It has been a challenging transition, but I am managing as well as can be expected under the circumstances." "Are you still in the Paradise Valley house?" Patricia asked, leaning forward slightly. "Or have you already made other arrangements?" The question was posed innocently enough, but I understood its real purpose. Patricia wanted to know whether Christopher had forced me out immediately, or whether I retained enough leverage to remain in our shared home during the divorce proceedings. The answer would signal to everyone at the table how acrimonious the separation was and how much power I retained in the relationship dynamic. "I am still there temporarily," I said, "but I have been looking at apartments in Tempe and Central Phoenix. I expect to be settled in my own place within the next month or so." The word apartments rather than condominiums or townhomes was deliberate. It suggested reduced financial circumstances, an acknowledgement that my post-divorce housing would be significantly more modest than what I had become accustomed to during my marriage. I watched the women at the table process this information, their expressions shifting subtly to incorporate this new data point into their understanding of my situation. "I imagine the job search must be stressful too," Susan said with carefully calibrated sympathy. "You have been out of the museum field for several years now. The market is probably quite different than when you were last working." I nodded, allowing her to believe that employment was indeed a pressing concern. "I have been reaching out to contacts and exploring various opportunities. The museum and gallery world is competitive, but I am hopeful something will develop in the coming months." What I did not mention was that I had no actual intention of seeking conventional employment. My inheritance generated passive income that exceeded what I could earn in any realistic museum position. But acknowledging that truth would undermine the entire performance I was maintaining, so I allowed Susan and the others to assume that I was anxiously pursuing job opportunities that would provide necessary income for my newly reduced lifestyle. The conversation shifted mercifully to other topics as the formal program began. A speaker from a local nonprofit discussed literacy initiatives in underserved communities. Another presenter outlined a mentorship program connecting professional women with high school students exploring career options. I listened with genuine interest to these programs, thinking about how I might eventually direct some of my resources toward similar causes once the divorce was finalized, and I was ready to reveal my actual capacity for philanthropic engagement. During the networking portion of the event that followed the formal presentations, I found myself in conversation with Elena Rodriguez, a woman I recognized from several charity committees we had both served on over the years. Elena ran a successful consulting firm focused on organizational development and had always struck me as more substantive and thoughtful than many of the women in our social circle. "I have been meaning to reach out to you," Elena said, guiding me toward a quieter corner of the ballroom where we could speak without being overheard. "I know you are going through a difficult time with your divorce, and I wanted you to know that I think Christopher is making a terrible mistake." I appreciated her directness and the apparent sincerity of her sentiment. "Thank you, Elena. That is kind of you to say." She shook her head firmly. "It is not just kindness. It is observation based on years of watching both of you at various events and gatherings. Christopher always struck me as someone who understood finance but did not understand people. He could analyze balance sheets and investment strategies, But he completely missed the actual value you brought to his life and his career. You made him seem more interesting and cultured than he actually is. Without you, he is just another wealth manager with an expensive car and a good suit. Her assessment was more insightful than she probably realized. Christopher had indeed benefited from our marriage in ways that had nothing to do with my financial contribution. I had provided him with cultural credibility, intellectual depth by association, and access to social circles that valued education and artistic sophistication. In replacing me with Kelsey, he was trading those benefits for someone who enhanced his professional image, but did nothing to offset his fundamental limitations in areas beyond finance. I imagine he will realize what he has lost eventually, I said carefully. But by then it will be too late to reverse the choices he has made. Elena studied my face with an intensity that made me slightly uncomfortable. You seem remarkably calm about all of this. I would be furious if I were in your position. Christopher is walking away with everything you built together while you have to start over from almost nothing. I chose my words with care, wanting to appear resilient without revealing too much. Starting over can be liberating in some ways. I have an opportunity to build a life that reflects my own values and interests, rather than constantly adapting to someone else's vision. There is value in that freedom even if it comes with financial challenges. Elena nodded slowly, though her expression suggested she was not entirely convinced by my philosophical acceptance of reduced circumstances. Well, if you need any support as you navigate this transition, please know that I am happy to help however I can. I have connections throughout the nonprofit and cultural sectors in Phoenix. If you are looking for board positions or consulting opportunities while you get back on your feet professionally, I would be glad to make introductions. Her offer was genuine and generous, motivated by what appeared to be authentic concern for my well-being. I thanked her sincerely and made a mental note that Elena Rodriguez was someone I would want to maintain a relationship with once my actual situation became public knowledge. She had shown decency and solidarity when she believed I was vulnerable, which suggested character that would remain consistent regardless of my financial status. The luncheon concluded with the usual ritual of farewells and promises to connect soon for coffee or lunch. I made my way through the crowd toward the exit, conscious of the whispered conversations that began as soon as I passed. The gossip was inevitable and probably intensified by my presence at the event. Women were speculating about the details of my divorce, discussing what they had heard about Christopher's relationship with Kelsey, and sharing their assessments of how I seemed to be handling the dissolution of my marriage. I drove from the Biltmore to a small coffee shop in central Phoenix where I had arranged to meet my mother. Caroline had been asking increasingly pointed questions about my marriage over the past several weeks, her maternal instincts detecting trouble even before I had shared any specific information about Christopher's plans to divorce. I had been vague in my responses, deflecting her concerns while I managed the complex legal and strategic dimensions of the separation. But the time had come to tell her the truth, or at least some version of it. My mother was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug of tea. She looked older than I remembered from our last meeting, new lines visible around her eyes and mouth. The stress of watching her daughter's marriage dissolve was clearly taking a toll even though she did not yet know the full story. I slid into the chair across from her and accepted her embrace before settling in to face whatever questions she had been accumulating. She studied my face with the particular intensity that only mothers can manage, looking for signs of distress or damage that I might be trying to hide. "Tell me everything," she said simply. No deflection, no vague reassurances. I need to know what is actually happening. I spent the next hour walking her through the narrative of my marriage's dissolution, though I edited the story carefully to focus on Christopher's affair and his decision to pursue divorce based on his assessment that I was not the right partner for this stage of his career. I described the prenuptial agreement and his confidence that he would retain all assets while I would leave with essentially nothing. I explained my plans to find an apartment and rebuild my professional life after years away from museum work. My mother listened with growing anger, her hands clenching around her tea mug hard enough that I worried the ceramic might crack. When I finished my explanation, she was silent for a long moment before speaking in a voice tight with controlled fury. "That man," she began, then stopped and started again. "I never completely trusted Christopher. He was always too smooth, too practiced in the way he presented himself. But I thought he genuinely cared for you. I thought he saw your value even if he expressed it in ways that sometimes made me uncomfortable. To learn that he was measuring your worth like some kind of investment that was not generating adequate returns makes me want to do things that would be unbecoming for a retired high school English teacher. Despite the seriousness of the conversation, I smiled at her barely restrained rage on my behalf. Mom, I appreciate your anger and your support. But I am going to be fine. Better than fine, actually. She looked at me skeptically. You are about to be divorced with no significant assets, no current employment, and years away from your professional field. I know you are strong and capable, but I do not understand how you can be so calm about facing those challenges. This was the moment I had been both anticipating and dreading. I needed to tell my mother about the inheritance, but I also needed to ensure she understood the importance of keeping that information completely private until the strategic moment for revelation arrived. I have not been entirely forthcoming about all aspects of my situation. I began carefully. There is information I have been keeping private for strategic reasons related to the divorce. But I need you to know the truth, so you do not spend the coming months worrying unnecessarily about my financial security. My mother's expression shifted from concern to confusion. What information? What have you been keeping private? I took a deep breath and laid out the story of my reconciliation with Marcus Aldridge during the final months of his life, his death, and the reading of his will that had left me as sole heir to his substantial estate. I explained the magnitude of the inheritance and the legal protections that ensured Christopher could make no claim to any portion of it. I described my decision to keep this information private initially, and the strategic advantages of allowing Christopher to proceed with the divorce under his mistaken assumptions about my financial vulnerability. My mother sat in stunned silence as I spoke, her tea growing cold while she processed information that fundamentally transformed her understanding of my situation. When I finally stopped talking, she remained quiet for another full minute before responding. $158 million, she said slowly, as if testing whether the words sounded real when spoken aloud. Your father left you $158 million. I nodded, watching her attempt to integrate this new reality into her existing framework for understanding our family's financial situation. My mother had lived modestly her entire adult life, managing a teacher's salary with care and planning, never experiencing the kind of wealth that removed financial constraint as a meaningful consideration. Why did you not tell me sooner? She asked, though her tone suggested she was genuinely curious rather than hurt by the omission. I have been worried sick about how you would manage after the divorce. I needed to keep the information absolutely private until the appropriate moment in the divorce proceedings, I explained. The fewer people who knew, the less risk there was of inadvertent disclosure. I trust you completely, Mom, but I also did not want to burden you with keeping this secret while also watching me appear to struggle with reduced circumstances. She reached across the table and took my hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. So when Christopher filed for divorce thinking you had nothing, he had no idea that you were actually wealthier than he could imagine. Exactly. And when he eventually discovered the truth through the required financial disclosures, he tried to reverse course and salvage the marriage. But by then he had already demonstrated what he truly valued, and what he thought of me when he believed I had nothing to offer beyond being his wife. My mother's expression hardened with something that looked like satisfaction. Good. Let him live with the consequences of his own limited vision and poor judgment. You deserve someone who sees your worth independent of your bank balance. We spent another hour talking through various aspects of my situation and my plans for the future. My mother asked thoughtful questions about estate planning and investment strategies, concerns about whether I had adequate professional guidance to manage wealth of this magnitude. I assured her that my father's attorney had connected me with excellent advisors, and that I was being thoughtful and strategic about long-term planning. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, my mother pulled me into another embrace, holding me tightly enough that I could feel her trembling slightly. I am so proud of you, she whispered. Not because of the money, though I am relieved you will have financial security. I am proud of how you have handled this entire situation with dignity and strategic intelligence. You could have been vindictive or petty, but instead you simply allowed Christopher to reveal his own character, while you maintained your composure and prepared for your future. Her words meant more to me than she probably realized. My mother's approval had always mattered deeply, perhaps because she had worked so hard to provide for my brother and me after my father left. She understood the value of resilience and strategic thinking in ways that people who had never faced genuine financial constraint often could not fully appreciate. I drove home to Paradise Valley feeling lighter than I had in months. Telling my mother the truth had lifted a burden I had not fully recognized I was carrying. Having her know that I was not actually facing the struggles everyone else assumed I would confront after the divorce made the ongoing performance feel less isolating and more like a shared strategy we were executing together. Christopher's car was not in the driveway when I arrived home, which meant he was either still at work or had gone somewhere else for the evening. The house felt different now that we both understood the actual power dynamics between us. I was no longer the dependent spouse grateful for whatever scraps of financial security he chose to leave me. I was an independently wealthy woman who had chosen to let him expose his own character before correcting his fundamental misunderstanding of our relative positions. I went to my study and opened my laptop to review emails from Margaret Chun about the progression of our divorce proceedings. The discovery phase was nearly complete, with both sides having submitted all required financial documentation and disclosures. Christopher's attorney had sent several communications requesting settlement conferences to discuss possible modifications to the terms outlined in the prenuptial agreement, language that clearly indicated they were hoping to negotiate some arrangement that would allow Christopher to benefit from my inheritance despite having no legal claim to it. Margaret had responded to each request with polite but firm declinations. The prenuptial agreement was clear and comprehensive. There was nothing to negotiate or modify. The divorce would proceed exactly as the contract specified, with each party retaining their separate assets and no spousal support flowing in either direction. Christopher would keep his wealth and I would keep mine. The marriage would be dissolved with surgical precision according to terms he himself had insisted upon years earlier when he believed they protected him from any claims I might make on his superior resources. The irony was so perfect it almost felt scripted. Christopher had wanted a prenuptial agreement to ensure that his wealth remained entirely his own regardless of what happened in our marriage. That same agreement now protected my vastly larger wealth from any claims he might make after discovering my inheritance. The contract he had used as a shield when he thought he was the valuable party in the marriage had become the barrier that prevented him from accessing resources that dwarfed everything he had worked his entire career to accumulate. I composed a brief email to Margaret confirming that I wanted to proceed exactly as we had discussed, with no negotiations or modifications to the settlement terms. The divorce should be finalized as quickly as possible under the straightforward division of assets the prenuptial agreement mandated. I wanted to move forward with my life and leave this chapter definitively closed. As I hit send on the email, I heard Christopher's car pull into the driveway. The sound of his garage door opening and closing indicated he was home for the evening, likely planning to spend time in his office managing client portfolios or perhaps talking on the phone with Kelsey about their plans once the divorce was finalized. I wondered what those conversations sounded like now that Christopher understood my actual financial position. Did he tell Kelsey about the magnitude of my inheritance? Did he explain to her that the woman he had dismissed as insufficiently ambitious was actually sitting on a fortune that exceeded the combined net worth of everyone they knew? Or did he maintain the original narrative, protecting his ego by concealing the extent of his miscalculation? The questions were interesting but ultimately irrelevant. Christopher's relationship with Kelsey, and how he explained our divorce to her was no longer my concern. I was building a future that had nothing to do with him or his opinions about my worth and value. Soon the divorce would be finalized. I would move out of this house that had never really felt like home, and I would begin creating a life that reflected my own priorities and values, rather than serving as a supporting character in someone else's story of success and achievement. I looked around my study, at the books I had collected and the few personal items that actually belonged to me rather than being part of the designer's carefully curated aesthetic vision. Soon these things would move with me to wherever I chose to live next. The performance of reduced circumstances would end. The truth would become public knowledge. And everyone who had pitted me or dismissed me or felt sorry for the struggles they assumed I would face would be forced to recalibrate their entire understanding of who I was and what I was capable of creating for myself. The thought filled me with quiet satisfaction and unexpected peace. The first time I saw Christopher and Kelsey together as an acknowledged couple, rather than as mentor and protege maintaining a facade of professionalism, was at the Cavendish Wealth Management Annual Partners Dinner in late May. The event was held at a private club in Scottsdale, an exclusive venue where membership required both substantial wealth and the right social connections. Christopher had mentioned the dinner weeks earlier, back when we were still maintaining some pretense of civilized cohabitation, asking whether I planned to attend given our separation status. I had confirmed my intention to be present, understanding that my absence would be interpreted as weakness or inability to face the social consequences of our failing marriage. Margaret Chun had encouraged my attendance, explaining that maintaining visibility in social settings where people expected to see me would reinforce the narrative that I was handling the divorce with grace and dignity, rather than hiding in embarrassment or distress. I dressed carefully for the evening in a dress I had owned for several years, elegant but not new, expensive enough to maintain appropriate standards but not so lavish as to contradict the narrative of impending financial constraint. My jewelry was minimal, just simple gold earrings and the wedding band I still wore because the divorce was not yet finalized. Every detail of my presentation communicated someone managing a difficult transition with as much composure as circumstances allowed. The club's dining room was arranged with long tables rather than the round configurations typical of most charity events. The seating had been carefully planned to group partners with their most important clients and strategic relationships. I found my name card at a table near the center of the room, positioned between two clients I recognized but did not know well. Christopher was seated 3 tables away, and Kelsey occupied the chair directly beside him in the position that would have been mine under different circumstances. She looked stunning in a way that seemed designed to emphasize the contrast between us. Her dress was current season designer wear, probably purchased specifically for this event, in a vibrant emerald shade that drew attention across the room. Her hair and makeup were professionally executed, creating a polished appearance that communicated both youth and sophistication. She moved through the space with visible confidence, comfortable in her role as Christopher's new partner in both professional and personal contexts. I watched her work the room during the cocktail reception that preceded dinner, noticing how she positioned herself in conversations. She would stand slightly behind and to the left of Christopher, close enough to signal their connection but not so close as to appear clingy or dependent. When he introduced her to clients or colleagues, she would offer a firm handshake and make direct eye contact, asking intelligent questions about their businesses or investment strategies. She was performing competence and partnership, demonstrating that she brought professional value beyond simply being Christopher's romantic interest. The contrast with how I had functioned at similar events was striking and clearly intentional. I had always positioned myself as supportive but secondary, allowing Christopher to dominate conversations while I offered occasional observations about art or culture when appropriate openings emerged. Kelsey instead inserted herself as an equal participant in financial discussions, referencing market trends and investment opportunities with the fluency that came from working daily in Christopher's industry. Several people approached me during the cocktail hour with expressions of sympathy or curiosity poorly disguised as concern. Margaret Sutton, whose family trust Christopher had managed for over a decade, touched my arm gently and asked how I was managing the transition. Her tone carried genuine kindness mixed with the unmistakable interest of someone eager to gather details she could later share with others. "I am doing well under the circumstances," I replied with a practiced smile. "These situations are never easy, but I am focused on moving forward and building the next chapter of my life." Margaret nodded with exaggerated understanding. It must be so difficult watching Christopher move on so quickly. She gestured subtly toward where Kelsey stood engaged in animated conversation with several partners. "But I suppose you will find your own path eventually. You are still young enough to start over." The comment was meant to be encouraging, but carried implications about my reduced prospects and the challenges of rebuilding life after divorce. Margaret assumed that my starting over would happen from a position of significant disadvantage, that I would struggle to find equivalent partnership or professional success after years as a non-working spouse. She had no framework for imagining that I might be starting over from a position of such overwhelming financial advantage that Christopher's new relationship represented a step down rather than a step up in terms of actual resources and opportunities. "I am fortunate to have options and possibilities ahead of me," I said neutrally, offering no specifics that might either confirm or challenge her assumptions. Life has a way of surprising us with unexpected developments. We were called to dinner before Margaret could probe further. I took my assigned seat and engaged in polite conversation with the clients on either side of me, discussing their businesses and offering thoughtful questions about their industries, while carefully avoiding any topics that might reveal information about my own situation. The skill of drawing others out while remaining opaque about oneself was one I had developed over years of these social performances, and it served me well now when privacy about my actual circumstances was strategically essential. The firm's managing partner stood to deliver welcoming remarks once everyone was seated, thanking clients for their continued trust and highlighting the year's achievements in terms of assets under management and investment returns. He made particular note of several partners who had brought in significant new business, and Christopher's name featured prominently in the recognition. The managing partner praised Christopher's ability to attract and retain high-net-worth clients, who appreciated his sophisticated approach to wealth preservation and growth strategies. Then the managing partner did something I had not anticipated. He acknowledged Christopher's personal transition and introduced Kelsey as someone who had become integral to the firm's success. He described her analytical capabilities and her growing client portfolio, noting that several major accounts had specifically requested to work with her based on her reputation and expertise. The introduction was carefully worded to be professional rather than personal, but the message was unmistakable. Kelsey was being positioned as Christopher's equal partner in professional contexts, not just as his romantic interest, but as a serious contributor to the firm's operations and success. The room applauded politely, and I watched Kelsey acknowledge the recognition with a gracious smile and slight nod. She did not stand or make any gesture that might appear attention-seeking, but she radiated satisfaction at being publicly validated in front of the firm's most important relationships. This was what Christopher had wanted, I realized. Not just a younger or more attractive partner, but someone whose professional achievements and credentials enhanced his own status and positioning within the competitive world of wealth management. I had never been able to provide that particular benefit. My education and cultural interests had given Christopher some intellectual credibility in certain social contexts, but I had never contributed to his client acquisition or his professional advancement within the firm. Kelsey offered something different, a partnership where both parties brought measurable professional value that could be quantified in terms of revenue generation and client satisfaction metrics. The realization did not sting the way it might have months earlier. I understood now that Christopher and I had always wanted fundamentally different things from marriage. He had wanted a strategic alliance that advanced his career and enhanced his social positioning. I had wanted genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. Those goals were not necessarily incompatible, but they required both parties to prioritize the relationship itself, rather than treating it primarily as a vehicle for achieving other objectives. Dinner proceeded through multiple courses, each dish presented with elaborate descriptions of ingredients and preparation techniques that seemed designed to justify the substantial cost of the event. Conversation at my table remained safely focused on business topics and travel plans, with occasional diversions into discussions of children's achievements or upcoming cultural events in Phoenix. I participated appropriately, while monitoring the dynamics at Christopher's table through peripheral observation. Kelsey was clearly in her element, engaging in animated discussions about emerging markets and cryptocurrency investment strategies. She referenced recent articles from financial publications and offered opinions about Federal Reserve policy implications with the confidence of someone who followed these topics professionally rather than as a casual observer. Christopher watched her with visible pride, occasionally adding his own perspectives but largely allowing her to demonstrate her expertise to the clients and colleagues surrounding them. The contrast with how he had watched me at similar events was profound. Christopher had never looked at me with that particular expression of pride in my professional capabilities, because I had never offered professional capabilities that he valued or respected. I had been decorative and appropriate, but never impressive in ways that mattered to him or to the world he operated in. Kelsey was impressive by his metrics, and his satisfaction in that impression was evident in every interaction I observed. During the brief interlude between dinner and dessert, several people moved between tables to continue networking conversations. I found myself approached by Thomas Bradford, one of the firm's senior partners who had always been cordial during our interactions over the years. Thomas was in his early 60s, successful enough to be semi-retired but still active in managing a select group of legacy clients whose families had worked with him for decades. "Vanessa," he said, settling into the temporarily vacant chair beside me. I wanted to express my sympathy about your situation with Christopher. I know these transitions are never easy regardless of the circumstances that precipitate them. I appreciated his directness and the absence of false concern or intrusive curiosity. Thank you, Thomas. I appreciate your thoughtfulness in acknowledging what is admittedly a difficult period. He nodded, then paused as if considering whether to continue with what he actually wanted to say. After a moment, he proceeded with careful diplomacy. I hope you will not take this as interference or unwelcome commentary, but I feel compelled to observe that Christopher is making a choice that prioritizes certain qualities over others. Kelsey is undoubtedly talented and professionally accomplished, but there are forms of value that are not captured in revenue reports or client acquisition metrics. The comment surprised me with its perceptiveness and its implicit criticism of Christopher's priorities. I had not expected anyone from the firm to suggest that Christopher might be making an error in judgment by choosing Kelsey over maintaining our marriage. That is generous of you to say, I replied carefully. I think Christopher is pursuing the kind of partnership that aligns with his values and his vision for his career. I cannot fault him for being clear about what matters most to him, even if I wish his priorities were different. Thomas studied my face with the kind of attention that suggested he was seeing beyond the careful composure I maintained in public settings. You are being remarkably gracious about a situation that would make many people bitter or vindictive. I suspect there is more to your circumstances than most people understand, but I respect your privacy too much to pry into matters that are not my business. The observation was astute enough to make me wonder what exactly Thomas suspected or intuited about my actual situation. Had he noticed something in my demeanor that suggested I was less concerned about financial security than people assumed I should be? Or was he simply remarking on the dignity with which I was handling a divorce that everyone believed left me at a significant disadvantage? Before I could formulate a response that would neither confirm nor deny his suspicions, Thomas stood and prepared to return to his own table. Whatever your next chapter holds, Vanessa, I hope it brings you the kind of partnership and recognition you deserve. Christopher may come to realize what he has lost, but by then I suspect you will have moved far beyond caring about his regrets. He left me with that observation, returning to his seat as dessert began to be served. I sat processing his words and wondering how many other people in the room were forming similar assessments about the dynamics they were witnessing. Christopher's public partnership with Kelsey was clearly designed to demonstrate that he had upgraded to a more valuable relationship, but at least some observers seemed to question whether the upgrade was as clear-cut as he wanted everyone to believe. The evening concluded with brief remarks from the managing partner thanking everyone for attending and highlighting upcoming firm initiatives. As guests began to depart, I made my way toward the exit, intending to slip out without any final interactions that might prove awkward or uncomfortable. But Christopher intercepted me near the coat check, appearing suddenly at my elbow with an expression that combined determination and something that might have been guilt or regret. "Can we talk for a moment?" he asked quietly, glancing around to ensure we would not be overheard by departing guests. I considered declining but decided that allowing him to say whatever he needed to say might actually serve my interests better than creating a scene through refusal. I nodded and followed him to a quiet alcove off the main corridor where we would have some privacy. Christopher stood facing me with his hands in his pockets, a posture that made him look younger and less certain than his usual carefully controlled presentation. "I wanted to say that you handled yourself well tonight. I know it could not have been easy attending this event given our circumstances and given Kelsey's presence." The comment was clearly meant as some kind of olive branch or acknowledgement of the difficulty of our situation. I accepted it with a neutral nod, offering nothing that would encourage him to continue in this vein. He pressed forward despite my lack of engagement. "I have been thinking about what you said after you disclosed your inheritance, about how I was only interested in reconciliation once I understood your financial position. You were right that my response was calculated rather than genuine. I have been struggling with what that says about me and about what I actually value in relationships." The admission was more self-aware than I had expected from Christopher, whose professional success had always depended on projecting certainty rather than acknowledging doubt or confusion. I remained silent, curious about where this moment of vulnerability might lead. Watching Kelsey tonight, seeing how well she fits into this world and how effectively she partners with me professionally, I should feel completely satisfied with my choice. She is everything I thought I wanted in terms of professional compatibility and shared understanding of my work. But there is something missing that I did not anticipate. He paused, seeming to struggle with articulating whatever realization he had reached. I looked at him with genuine curiosity, wondering whether he was capable of actual insight into his own emotional limitations, or whether this was simply another form of strategic positioning. What is missing is the sense that she sees me as anything more than a professional opportunity and a relationship that advances her career, Christopher finally said. You may not have understood my work the way Kelsey does, but you seem to care about me as a person separate from what I could provide professionally or financially. I did not appreciate that until it was gone. The observation was astute but also fundamentally too late. Christopher was recognizing a form of value only after he had definitively discarded it in favor of qualities he could measure and quantify. His regret was real but also irrelevant to any possibility of changing the trajectory we were on. Christopher, I said gently, what you are describing is not actually about me specifically. It is about the realization that no relationship built primarily on strategic compatibility and professional utility will provide the kind of emotional intimacy and genuine partnership that humans need. You may be reaching that understanding with Kelsey, but you would eventually reach the same understanding with anyone you chose based on the same criteria. He looked at me with an expression that suggested I had articulated something he had been feeling but had not been able to name. So what do I do with that understanding? You proceed with the life you chose based on the values you prioritized. You marry Kelsey or you do not, but you make that decision based on who you actually are and what you genuinely want rather than what you think you should want based on professional logic. And you accept that some choices close doors permanently, that some relationships cannot be revived once they have been definitively ended. Christopher nodded slowly, absorbing the finality in my words. I suppose I hoped that we might eventually find some way to remain friendly, to preserve some connection even if we could not be married. I considered his hope and recognized it as another form of wanting to retain access to something he had discarded. Christopher wanted the comfort of knowing I was still available as some kind of backup option or emotional support system, even as he pursued his primary relationship with Kelsey. But I had no interest in serving that function for him. I think it is better for both of us if we make a clean break, I replied. Once the divorce is finalized, we should move forward with separate lives and minimal contact. That will allow each of us to build whatever comes next without the complications of trying to maintain a friendship that would always be shadowed by the history of how our marriage ended. He looked disappointed but not surprised by my position. I suppose you are right. It just feels like such a complete loss of everything we built together. I almost laughed at the characterization but managed to maintain my composure. Christopher, we did not build anything together. We created an arrangement that served your professional advancement and your social positioning. I contributed to that arrangement for 6 years, but it was always your project rather than our shared endeavor. What you are losing is not a partnership but rather the specific benefits I provided that you did not adequately value until they were withdrawn. The bluntness of my assessment seemed to hit him with unexpected force. His face registered something between pain and recognition, the look of someone confronting an unflattering truth they had been avoiding. Before he could formulate a response, Kelsey appeared at the edge of the alcove, clearly having noticed Christopher's extended absence and come looking for him. She took in the scene with quick assessment, her eyes moving between Christopher and me with obvious calculation about what this private conversation might mean. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but I could see the tension in her shoulders and the slight tightening of her jaw that suggested she was not entirely comfortable finding her new partner in close conversation with his soon-to-be ex-wife. Sorry to interrupt, she said with false brightness. But several clients wanted to continue the conversation at the bar next door, and they were asking for both of us. Christopher nodded and straightened his posture, visibly shifting from whatever emotional vulnerability he had been experiencing back into his professional persona. I should go. Thank you for taking the time to talk, Vanessa. He moved toward Kelsey, who watched me with an expression that combined triumph and uncertainty. She had interrupted our conversation and reclaimed Christopher's attention, asserting her position as his current priority. But some part of her clearly wondered what we had been discussing and whether Christopher's obvious emotional engagement with me suggested that she occupied less secure ground than she wanted to believe. I offered them both a polite smile and headed toward my own car, feeling relieved to be finished with the performance of the evening. The drive back to Paradise Valley took me through quiet streets lined with expensive homes and carefully manicured landscapes. I thought about Christopher's admission that something felt missing in his relationship with Kelsey despite her professional compatibility and shared understanding of his work. The realization suggested that even when people got exactly what they thought they wanted, it often proved insufficient to provide genuine satisfaction or fulfillment. Christopher had pursued Kelsey because she matched his criteria for professional partnership and career advancement. But criteria developed through analytical assessment rarely captured the full complexity of what humans needed from intimate relationships. Professional compatibility might make for effective business partnerships, but it was not the same thing as the emotional intimacy and genuine care that sustained marriages through difficulty and change. I pulled into the driveway of the house I still shared with Christopher for another few weeks, and sat in my car looking at the structure we had inhabited together for 6 years. Nothing about the building suggested the dramatic transformation occurring in both our lives. From the outside, everything looked exactly as it always had, the expensive architecture and desert landscaping communicating wealth and success, and the achievement of conventional markers of prosperity. But inside those walls, everything had fundamentally changed. Christopher now understood that his wife possessed resources that exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. I now understood that the marriage I had invested in was always more about strategic positioning than genuine partnership. We were both moving toward a future that looked nothing like what we had imagined when we stood in front of family and friends and promised to build a life together. The difference was that my future held possibilities and resources I was only beginning to explore, while Christopher's future consisted of recognizing too late that he had discarded something valuable in pursuit of qualities that ultimately proved less fulfilling than he had anticipated. His regret was predictable and also irrelevant to my own trajectory forward. I climbed out of my car and walked into the house, already mentally preparing for the next phase of my carefully constructed performance. The divorce would be finalized soon, I would move into my own space, and the truth about my inheritance would become progressively more public. Christopher and Kelsey would build whatever life they chose together, and I would build something entirely my own based on values and priorities they had never bothered to understand or appreciate. The thought filled me with quiet anticipation and unexpected joy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.